Animation, an often highly underappreciated craft which involves much labor and turmoil, yet the end result is always worth it. Trust me, I can tell you that from experience. Animation is highly applauded in places like the East, yet arguably it is highly devalued in the West, especially in a culture where people seek shallow entertainment that is only made for profit. Of course, not everybody thinks this way, but you can definitely tell there's this agenda to devalue animation as merely kid stuff. It's not that appealing to kids with animation is in itself a bad thing. It's just that if we focus entirely on just that, we are highly devaluing what animation is capable of. It's not just a medium to tell some fun fairy tales. It is also a medium that can be used to fulfill a filmmaker's vision. It can depict anything. It can tell stories with great potential for thematic depth. It can tell stories of real-life events and remind cultures of their upbringing and the importance of where the foundations of their moral compasses lie. Such films are truly ambitious. And more than 2 decades ago, Jeffrey Katzenberg wanted to make a movie based on the Bible. Upon suggesting it to Disney CEO Michael Eisner, Jeffrey was denied this opportunity. Jeffrey Katzenberg would then go on to found DreamWorks alongside David Geffen and legendary director Steven Spielberg. The three of them had a discussion of the elements that would make for a spectacular animated film. Jeffrey said, "It's got to be a fantastic story, one that would be hard to tell in live action, one that is epic and grand." Steven paused, then said, "You mean as epic and grand as the story of Moses and the 10 Commandments?" That's exactly what Jeffrey meant. Thus, for one of the first debut movies of DreamWorks Animation Studios, 400 artists from 26 different countries would spend 3.5 years of their lives creating one of the most ambitious, spectacular, and all-round epic and awesome biblical movies ever made. The Prince of Egypt.
God bless you all, Scotsman here, and happy Passover week. I'm looking forward to Easter. And I'm looking forward to talking about this movie. Yeah, you know this movie's gonna be great, but even people of other beliefs say that this movie is great. This movie can be as grand and epic as Ben-Hur and Lawrence of Arabia and the 10 Commandments. Well, mainly because it took inspiration from Lawrence of Arabia and the 10 Commandments movie. Yet who would have thought that an animated musical featuring Jeff Goldblum and Steve Martin in it would make for a spectacular masterpiece?
Life finds a way.
Oh, where do I begin? Where do I begin? Start from the beginning. And when you get to the end... Yeah, might as well just start from the start.
Animation, an often high...
Not that start! We already did that! Now, all of you already know that a lot of ambition was put into making this film. Actually, with a film that is biblically rooted in historical events, not only did they have to make an epic animated movie, but they also had to make a movie that would respect the biblical sources. And I'm going to say straight off the bat that this interpretation of Exodus is not entirely biblically accurate. For example, Moses is not being assisted by his brother Aaron in this movie when he's confronting Pharaoh to let his people go. Whereas in scripture, it was made clear that Aaron helped Moses to speak in public. In fact, it was Aaron that did most of the speaking and miracles for Moses. And the baby Moses was found by the Pharaoh's daughter, not really the queen herself as such. And depending on your academic views, there may or may not have been some friction between Zipporah and Moses' siblings. But something that I find really admirable about this movie is that it acknowledges its own biblical inaccuracies. right at the very start of the movie, you see this. An honestly brutal title that says, the motion picture you're about to see is an adaptation, note, adaptation of the Exodus story. While artistic and historical license has been taken, we believe that this film is true to the essence, values, and integrity of a story that is a cornerstone of faith for millions of people worldwide. The biblical story of Moses can be found in the book of Exodus. So, while the film may not be fully accurate, at least the heart and soul of the story is still there. And anyone, regardless of belief, can appreciate that. Especially when the DreamWorks team had to confront Christian scholars and theologians, Jewish scholars and theologians, and Islamic scholars and theologians to make for a faithful adaptation. Highly monotheistic roots, in case you couldn't get that already. And like all the best epic movies, it starts out big. As Lego Batman would say, darkness. All great stories start in darkness. Then the title appears. Then the music plays. The wind blows. You can't really see the wind as such, but just like God, you know it's there. We see a twirl of beautiful peachy pink clouds. A lullaby plays in an almost militarized fashion, as if one were to salute the trumpet. And I love this insight from YouTuber Durbania, symbolization of that cloud formation. Take a look.
One of the things that I thought was very cool about this movie, like the opening song, Deliver Us, it puts you in the mindset you needed to be. It brought the energy up of the song. But what's interesting, and I caught it this time as I was watching it, kind of the cloud formations in the very beginning looked very similar to me as the fire when God was talking to Moses in the burning bush, which then to me symbolizes the fact that there was God with them from the very beginning, hearing their song, their cry for deliverance, which is what he said in the burning bush to Moses. I have heard my people's cry, and I am sending you to deliver them.
Then, big head, big Egyptian head, people are pushing. Then, mud, sand, musical sequence. The scenery is huge. And if you look very closely, the scenery is also highly textured. According to some behind-the-scenes stories, CGI films like Toy Story and even DreamWorks' own Ants were rising in popularity. And this was almost a last hurrah for painted backgrounds. And they went out with a bang with this one. Trust me, as someone who's painted landscapes, like this one, these are truly people who understand that you can't have a painting without a painter. Much like how God paints the bigger picture, eh? Landscapes are rich with detail and texture and color. And you'd think for a film largely set in the desert, they'd make the mistake of making it a bland, generic color tone, but no. You'd be surprised by how many colors you'd find in places like the desert, or even amongst the plant life and the clothes of the people who were living there at the time. It's rich in detail, and combine that with the excellent visual storytelling, which I'll analyze later, it makes for a true feast of the eyes, if my eyes could eat. Nom 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 nom. I've also done my fair share of animated landscapes with various layers on them. A bit tricky to pull off. I use Adobe After Effects for that. It's especially tricky when you're making elaborate set pieces, even from like the start of the film. Yet they made the most of their tech. They even added in a few bits of CGI to enhance bits of their film. And it doesn't distract the movie. In fact, the more I watch it, the better it gets. In fact, the same could be said for most of this movie. The more I watch it, the better it gets. It's like watching Disney's Beauty and the Beast, which oddly enough has one of the same directors, Brenda Chapman, who worked on Prince of Egypt. And even though families of all ages can watch this, they don't hold back on the grittiness. They show the brutality of the enslavement of the Hebrews. They showcase the Pharaoh and his family and his magicians doing anything they can to glorify their pagan gods, which enabled them the excuse to abuse their power on the Hebrews. And the Pharaoh, in fear of an uprising and not knowing Joseph who came before, sent out his guards to kill all the firstborn of all the slaves' families. Yeah, they show the guards on the patrol with those swords. You see them push the mothers aside and killing the babies, like, yikes. Okay, like, they don't do any, like, rated 15 or violence or anything, but definitely happened. There is a later scene where slaves are being whipped, with their scars shown and blood and stains on the wall. This film's gritty, mates. I love it for it. But of course, the heart of this story is not about violence. It's about freedom and redemption. One Hebrew mother protected her baby son by placing him in a basket and set him adrift on the River Nile. Stephen Schwartz and Hans Zimmer were responsible for the lyrics and music respectively. And all of the songs are legitimately great. None of the songs feel like fodder. All the songs carry the same amount of weight as the film does. And some particular tunes would be repeated like leitmotifs for thematic significance. In this case, the lullaby, with a heavenly, soothing tone to it. A genuine motherly intimacy. So, baby goes adrift in the Nile, bumps into the Pharaoh's palace, and gets taken in as one of their own and is named Moses. Which meant to come out of the river. To be delivered from the river. Now, in the scriptures, Moses' relatives did get a bit more time to take care of Moses before bringing him into the Pharaoh's family. Yet, even still, the whole thing about creative liberties was established before, and the heart of the story remains. So after the spectacular opening number, we see Moses grown up, living a carefree life under the rich family of the Pharaoh. In this movie, this carefree nature is depicted with brotherly camaraderie. According to archaeological experts, the most likely pharaoh to have ruled during the time when Moses was trying to free the slaves was Ramesses II. So they did do their homework for this film, because Moses' brother is called Ramesses. This is an aspect of the film that has been praised a lot. In previous adaptations, Moses and Pharaoh were straight up enemies. In this adaptation, the film tells the story in a new way, which reminds us, well, Moses was a part of this family temporarily. And perhaps if his family, in Egypt that was, if they were more humble, then maybe they would have repented too. But there's a striking tragedy that occurs between Moses and Ramesses. And in this creative adaptation, it makes for some excellent drama. And the build-up to this drama is surprisingly well built up, even from this fun-packed scene. Here I suspect they've taken a few hints from Ben-Hur. Ben-Hur, even though Ben-Hur's a fictional story, not Exodus, Ben-Hur 2 features a story between a righteous hero and a prideful enemy who were once friends. And they both have a chariot race together! Now, some may say that the comedy's a little distracting. Some people may even say, I don't know what they were sphinxing. That, alongside some of the celebrity voices, can be distracting at first, admittedly. But once you understand the tone that the movie is aiming for, and if you look at the bigger picture of how everything builds up on one another, I think you'll really appreciate how it's built up. In this case, this fun chariot scene is meant to build a camaraderie between Moses and Ramesses. And it is quite a spectacular scene. And immediately afterwards, Moses and Ramesses are told off by their father? The Pharaoh. Played here by Patrick Stewart. And even from an early scene, you can tell that the Pharaoh's got a lot of pride in him. From the visuals, there's this statue placed there on purpose to emphasize the significance of the Pharaoh, as well as give the king, Pharaoh, a picturesque scene of Egypt. These visual contrasts become all the more tense when the Pharaoh says to Ramesses, "One weak link can ruin a mighty dynasty." Then through a series of events, Moses meets Zipporah, out of sympathy helps Zipporah escape, tries to go looking for Zipporah, and then bumps into his siblings. I could analyze the whole thing all day, but we don't have much time. Here we get some tense drama, and Miriam tells Moses, You may be your father, boy, but he wasn't your daddy. Moses is questioned to challenge the authority of his father. And thinking about it theologically, this in turn would set off a series of events in which Moses would seek and find his real father. Just when Moses is leaving in refusal, now cut this bit out. And again, the way Aaron is depicted here, as good a job as Jeff Goldblum does in depicting a character who's trying not to get into trouble, again, I probably wouldn't say this is biblically accurate per se. I understand the role that they've given him, but it's not biblically accurate. Let's just say Aaron was much more of a direct supporter than he was in this movie. But again, you learn to forgive, let it go. Just when Moses is about to leave in denial, Miriam sings it. The lullaby. See what I mean by leitmotifs? There's even some brilliant visual storytelling when Miriam looks up to him in the exact same way that his mother did when he first drifted away on the Nile. Drifting back to the Pharaoh's palace, Moses recognizes that lullaby and begins to question his true heritage. He begins seeing the Hebrews not as objects, but as real people, his own kind of people. Then he flees back to the palace with a song almost akin to Who Am I from Les Miserables. This is another song that will have leitmotifs with different meanings throughout the story. None of the songs feel corny. That's what I'm especially impressed by. Each of the songs belong in their different sequences. And if handled right, music can be a great way of evoking people's emotions. And evoke so in a way that people can remember it. And sing along! Aesthetic beauty. From a purely survivalist mentality, aesthetics would be seen as worthless. Yet, we value aesthetics almost more than anything, as if it were pointing towards something greater. In this sequence, Moses thinks, I've got all the comforts I need. What more could I want? Oh, pardon me, all that he could want. Pardon me, I'm forgetting the difference between a character wants and a character needs. That's kind of a crucial part of storytelling, Calum. He's got what he wants, but he's blind to what he needs. He falls asleep, and we get a pretty freaky animated sequences of a nightmare depicted in hieroglyphs, which in turn forces Moses to investigate said hieroglyphic walls to uncover the shocking visual truth. The Pharaoh had been killing Hebrew babies. Now here's something else I really appreciate about this movie. Like many movies that came before, it's so easy to depict the villains as black capes, horns, wahaha. But here's what makes the Pharaoh really scary in this version. Most, if not all the time, villains are common people like you and me. The Pharaoh ventures into the scene. He seems to be wandering around in regret, saying that sometimes for the greater good, sacrifices must be made. Moses is honestly shocked. Sacrifices? Then comes the freaky part. Oh, Moses, Pharaoh says. Oh, they were only slaves. Wow! More older people watching this will be taken aback like, whoa! He sees the Hebrews as worthless objects. The Pharaoh is deluding himself. And the Pharaoh thinks he can play God. And the Pharaoh tries to avoid moral accountability, to make things his way. So he'll dehumanize anyone he doesn't want in his vision. The moment he's able to dehumanize them, he has the right to do anything he wants with them as a form of abuse of power. Our God, in comparison, sees everyone as people. People who ought to find freedom. All people who are valued. And the next scene, some would see this as a scene of comfort, but let's be honest, I don't think the Pharaoh's wife, the Queen, is doing much favors either. as sincere as she is depicted here. Once again, repeating the song that Moses sang when he was in denial of what Miriam said to him. This is your home. This will come back one more time. And I remember the Queen, in her version of All I've Ever Wanted, she says, when the gods, note gods, when the gods send you a blessing, you don't ask why it was sent, ... More of an emotional response rather than an intellectual response, as if to say, oh, don't you dare question it, lest you leave our pagan ways. Stay in the comfort zone. Of course, the Queen probably didn't mean it like that. But words are a very powerful thing. And in case you couldn't tell, I'm the sort of person who delves deep into the deeper meaning of things. See, blind faith is very dangerous. We ought to be basing our beliefs on what is factually true, even if it's discomforting. And speaking of discomforting, in the next scene, Ramesses is making big plans to form the buildings. I forgot to mention in an earlier scene, Ramesses gave Moses the honor of being a lead architect and giving him a blue beetle ring as a sign of this importance. People often say the first day on the job's quite rough, but this first day on the job for Moses was really rough. Ramesses and his men are seeing the big, grand picture of epic buildings and epic halls, filled with color, filled with glory. But Moses is starting to see the secret behind the curtain.
Also, I recently came across this video, a short analysis of this one scene in which Ramesses sets out to do some construction work. As this woman was analysing the scene shot by shot about how it appropriately captures the audience's attention using rule of thirds and composition, it makes me appreciate all the movie more. But then this person was reminding me that this was the same site that Moses and Ramesses were fooling around in chariots with earlier. That's right, all the slaves here are cleaning up the mess that Moses and Ramesses made. Oh boy, talk about responsibility. See, the goofy scenes do have purpose when you're paying attention.
No longer ignorant of the suffering of the slaves, we see from Moses' perspective the labor that the slaves are going through. And then it happens. This one poor old Hebrew is being practically abused by one of the slave masters. Moses interferes and kills him. Moses is so ashamed of his act of murder that he runs away from Egypt in exile. And in this creative adaptation, we get a great confrontation between Moses and Ramesses. Ramesses insists, no, we can change things. After all, Ramesses is the up-and-coming pharaoh, the self-idolatrous god of Egypt. People worship Pharaoh, you see. So the Pharaoh can change the rules as he sees fit. But Moses says, no, you can't change it. You can't change the past. Then Moses repeats the same words that Miriam said to him. Ask the man you once called father. Runs off into the desert. Ramesses screams Moses' name. Here's another bit of visual storytelling that I love. We get several shots of Moses running into the desert. First, we see his emotional reaction as he runs. Then we pan out of him running into the desert as he continuously runs to the right. Then we pan out again. He continues to run to the right. And again. And again. As if the more Moses is running into the desert, the more dwarfed and overwhelmed he is by this massive desert. And it also further emphasizes his feeling of being lost, being overwhelmed by everything that just happened. The warm color palette, and that scraping of the foot, emphasizes how weakened Moses has been in this circumstance. And to emphasize his shame on who he used to be, he tears apart his Egyptian golden garments and takes a look at his ring from his brother for a while. In this creative adaptation, Moses gets buried alive. Then we get another light-hearted scene. Again, some might find the goofy scenes a bit distracting, but looking at the bigger picture of things, I think the light-hearted tone of this scene is an indication that Moses has made it to somewhere safe, somewhere civilized. In fact, the comedy serves to show the fact that Moses is a bit out of his league at this point in the story. And all he's thinking about is water, and later on, at least according to this creative adaptation, the livelihood of some young woman being harassed by some thugs. Reunited with Zipporah once again, first impressions are tough, but they both warm up to each other after Moses meets Jethro, Zipporah's father. And here we get a song which I think anyone can agree is a wonderful song. Many people who were hostile to the Jewish faith back in the days of the Old Testament would often focus on grandeur, as if to boast that they could be greater than God himself. The Jews, in comparison, were a humble people who counted their blessings and thanked their God for even the smallest of things that they could have. Never underappreciate the miracles around you. After all, a single living cell is billions of times more complicated than any machine we can make today. And you may even want a better electronic device to watch this video I'm making, but you should be thankful that you're able to see this video. In the context of the song, Jethro sings, "A single thread in a tapestry, though its color brightly shine, it can never see its purpose in the pattern of the grand design." Don't underappreciate those little threads. And the stone that sits on the very top of a mountain's mighty face doesn't think it's more important than the stones that form the base. A stone at the top of the mountain may feel quite prideful, but the stone wouldn't have managed to get there if it wasn't for the foundation. In another bizarre way, the Pharaoh may see himself at the top of the food chain and the top of his game, but he wouldn't have gotten this far unless he had what God had provided him with in the first place. What God provided and then the Pharaoh misused. But in the Pharaoh's pride, he always wants more and more. It's like the story Yertle the Turtle. That king was never quite satisfied with the pile that he made, was never thankful for what power he did have. He wanted more and more to the point of it becoming an obsession, but that ultimately led to his downfall. The Jewish people in this scene, on the other hand, are happy to be submissive to what God has to offer to them. They are content with the blessings that they receive: food, water, shelter, family, livelihood, livestock, music, dancing, love and joy, and they're living a lifestyle in which they don't really need anything more than what they have. And because God provides these people with just enough to get by, as well as the means to demand each other's companionship and teamwork, so that no one will feel dominant over the other, a loving community is formed. And this kind of love is what God is seeking. And this love, in return, is what makes Moses and these Jewish people happy. That's where the real love and freedom is. That's the end goal of the Exodus. Peace and order that would further be controlled later with the writing of the 10 Commandments. And going back to the song, it speaks a message that gets the listeners to be encouraged to reject materialistic gain and even reject materialism, and to encourage listeners to see the bigger picture and to see beauty, wholesomeness, and meaning that transcends the material realm and focuses on a love that lasts forever. And this love, in return, helps people in this life. So how do you judge what a man is worth? By what he builds or buys? You can never see with your eyes on earth. Look through heaven's eyes. For what should profit a man if he gains the whole world but loses his soul? Also during the sequence, Moses falls in love with and eventually marries Zipporah. And fun fact for Muslims, Zipporah was said to be Ethiopian. And then comes my favorite scene in the entire movie. Moses is doing his shepherd work, a job which would definitely be crucial for later on in his life, as he would guide his people like the sheep that they were. Oh yes, Moses was a shepherd of sheep, but now he would become a shepherd of people. Now, in terms of creative adaptations, before this movie came out, the burning bush scene often had a bit of trouble with visual effects. The classic Ten Commandments film, for example, as great as it was, their version of the burning bush was ironically a bit more cartoonish than, well, the animated film. You see, you don't have to associate cartoonish with animated. Animated can depict anything once. The Prince of Egypt takes advantage of the fact that it's an animated film and uses its visual potential to its maximum here. Everything about this scene is presented as otherworldly, for lack of a better word. The visuals, the acting, and especially the music from the ever so amazing composer Hans Zimmer makes for this incredible atmosphere in the scene. I would highly recommend you look up Hans Zimmer's score. Hans Zimmer's score in this movie is just as awesome as the songs in the soundtrack. Burning Bush, Hans Zimmer, look it up. You won't regret it. Play it with the scene with me. There's no dialogue at first, just the intrigue of the fact that a bush is on fire, yet it's not burning up. It's not destroying the bush. If anything, it's making the bush more alive. Tries burning up. He tries touching the fire with his staff. It doesn't burn up. And the fire has this ethereal purple glaze to it, which would also change colors to this warm, honey-like orange. It's interesting to know that in previous adaptations, God was depicted with a big booming voice. In this adaptation, however, they take a much more thoughtful approach. You see, God is every much as loving as he is commanding, and this is beautifully combined in this scene. God is intimate, as well as attention-grabbing, and the filmmakers made a brilliant filmmaking decision to get Val Kilmer, who voices Moses, to also be the voice of God, as well as record the dialogue of God with some of the other characters in subtle ways. There is so much you could read into that. If you were to ask me how I would interpret it from a theological standpoint, God is speaking to Moses in various aspects. Not only is God physically, verbally talking to Moses, he's also spiritually influencing his conscience. I love how throughout most of the scene, he's speaking in a very peaceful, yet still very authoritative tone. I am that I am. I have seen the oppression of my people in Egypt, and have heard their cry. Something that's interesting here is Moses' emotional reaction, especially when he once again hears the whip of the slave master, and his own voice saying, "Stop it, leave that man alone," as if God were appealing to his moral compass, to act for justice, and to step outside his comfort zone. God here can also tell the future, as shown when he teaches Moses what to say, and Moses hears himself say, "Let my people go." Now, the only thing that could have enhanced this scene further was to have God showcase the miracles, like showcasing how he could turn his staff into a snake and back again. God also told Moses to put his hand in his bosom. It came out, and it was affected with leprosy. God told him to do it again. Moses put his hand back in his bosom, put it out again, and his hand was cleaner than before. Although what they did get biblically Although what they did get biblically accurate was Moses' hesitation to go there, to go back to Egypt. Then we get an amazing sequence of God raising his voice in authority. In the next scene afterwards, I love how God raises his voice in authority and tells Moses, amongst his nervousness to go back to Egypt, "Who made man's mouth? Who made the mute, the deaf, the seeing, or the blind? Have not I?" And then afterwards he comforts Moses, saying that he will be with Moses. He will teach him what to say. He will give Moses the confidence in time. And most importantly, God will showcase to Egypt that he is the one true God capable of many miracles. And the visuals, the emotions, and everything that goes along with this scene, it gives you this amazing sense of wonder. It's like when you see a sunset, or look at the Milky Way in space, or read something like this, or see an astounding work of art. And the scene that goes after this, as an impact of Moses' encounter with God, is also amazing. Moses runs to Zipporah and tells him everything that he had just encountered. And I love how the sheer weight of everything is told through Hans Zimmer's amazing music, which is still the Burning Bush song. And the animation is really expressive in depicting the emotions of Moses and Zipporah as the both of them feel the immense weight and glory of what God has in store for them. Then we get a brief intimate scene where he showcases to Zipporah the love that their community has, the kind of love that God offers, the kind of love that his people in Egypt ought to be having. So then they travel to Egypt. We get a brilliant scene of Moses and Zipporah traveling by camel. As they move towards the camera with Moses' determined face, we see faded blurs and transitions of the Hebrew people being abused to further signify the goal of Moses' mission. And in this creative interpretation, this is where the drama begins between Moses and Ramesses, being built up as brothers. Ramesses is surprisingly joyful to see Moses is back. And in this film, Moses is happy to see Ramesses too, much to everyone else's surprise on both sides. Ramesses pardons Moses of all former crimes. But alas, it's too good to be true and reality sets back in. Moses has got a mission to do. Moses and the audience knows. Moses and the audience knows. It's not gonna work the way Ramesses sees it. And Moses reminds him, "Look, I do love you, but there's something I need to tell you." You see, real love is honest. After Moses says, "The God of the Hebrews has spoken to me," Ramesses says, "What?" Lets go of Moses' shoulders and steps back due to his own hostility towards any opposing authority that would challenge his throne as Pharaoh. And so, Moses took his staff. In the scriptures it was Aaron who did this, but just go along with this creative adaptation. To prove God's authority to the Pharaoh and to the Egyptians. He showcased the power of God transforming his staff into a snake. This is the God who created the universe from nothing. This is the God who could finally tune an entire universe. Turning a staff into a snake is mere child's play in comparison. So with that kind of miracle right before their eyes, you'd think that the Pharaoh would change his mind and let the Hebrews go free. Ooh, no. That Pharaoh was a stubborn one, he was. Clearly and painfully described as a man with a heart of stone. You see, whereas men of the true God have a heart of flesh, which enables them to remain humble. Pharaoh's heart was stone, cold, and he remained prideful. I love Ramesses' reaction. Well, impressive. It's as if he knows he saw a genuine miracle in front of him, yet he's very hesitant to admit it. So in a desperate ploy to showcase that he, the pharaoh, was somehow greater than God, he called upon his magician to quite literally put on a show. Once again, there's a very interesting take on this creative interpretation. In previous adaptations, the magicians were depicted to have done just the same thing as Moses did, stole their staff from the ground, turned into a snake. In this adaptation, they dedicate an entire musical song called Playing with the Big Boys to showcase just how far these magicians will go to boast about their so-called powers. And you can tell that they're focusing more on putting on a show than doing miracles, at least in this version. As the whole song sequence literally starts with them calling upon darkness in the room and smoke and mirrors. During this song, now a lot of people will admit that this is probably their least favorite bit in the whole film, because the whole film was taking itself quite seriously, yet some characters are drawn and acted out a bit weirdly. Yet here, I think it does so to serve the scene's favor. Here the goofy character design and sinister song can actually add to the sense of discomfort and hostility, which in a meta-narrative sense heightens the conflict of the story. And during the climax of the song, the magicians are seen clanging their staffs together, and they're constantly chanting the names of their Egyptian pagan gods. And then at one point, two magicians clang these staffs together, then a flash of light appears, and then they are holding snakes. This could subtly indicate that the magicians are using practical trickery rather than genuine magic. But of course, it could also be true that the Egyptian magicians were also dabbling in dark sorcery. Or maybe it was a mixture of dark sorcery and practical tricks. It's kind of scary how that thing is not entirely uncommon. But whatever it may be, dark sorcery, practical trickery, or both, it's obvious to see that even two snakes cannot stand against the power of the real God. The magicians keep on boasting, but then the snake from Moses' staff eats both the snakes that the magicians conjured up. Moses' staff snake ate the other two snakes. Talk about power dynamics. And it's interesting to think that if these magicians really did have powers similar to God, then surely you'd think that they would use their powers in a way that would make the situation better, that would settle the hostility. But they're too prideful for that. Instead, in misusing their abilities, in hostility, they ironically keep making the situation worse. A reflection of the stubbornness of the pharaoh indeed. So after the display, Moses and Ramesses meet in another room.
I wanted to bring some particular attention to this scene right here. Thank you, Max Cannon, for providing it. I am sorry if this is going to infringe some copyright, but I'll use some still images. So, take a look at this scene here, without any sound on. Okay, look at this scene here. We start from Moses' perspective. He's looking down and seeing the hard labor of his people. It's grueling. There's hundreds of them, doing back-breaking labor, day by day. This is what Moses is seeing, and this is what Moses is focusing on. Moses wants to liberate the people. So then, we return to the conversation. Moses is still looking down, concerned for his people. He asks Ramesses, "What do you see?" Moses sees the slaves. Ramesses comes in. Well, there was a glimpse of him looking at the slaves at first, but then, in his pride, he deliberately looks on with a smirk. and sees the labors that he's intending to create. In the next shot afterwards, we see a panoramic view of what Ramesses sees. He sees a greater Egypt than that which his father came before. Ramesses is particularly prideful, probably because there's a giant statue modeled after him, bigger than the one his father made of himself before. Talk about an ego boost. I mean, thank God for effective, nuanced visual storytelling.
It's clear from these scenes, and a bit of historical research, that these men have a bit in common. Both Moses and Ramesses were influential leaders, and both men got married and had children. Historical records say that Moses married 2 wives during his lifestyle. One of his wives died before he married the other. Ramesses, on the other hand, had many wives, his favorite being Nefertari, who may or may not have been that woman behind Ramesses' throne, if you were paying attention. And Ramesses had around 100 sons and 50 daughters. Oh my, someone's been busy. But of course, where these men now differ is in how they ought to treat people. And it's amazing how this conflict and how Moses and Ramesses view people and how they perceive personal responsibility and legacy is perfectly captured even without the sound on. Moses' fierce concentration on the Hebrew slaves, Ramesses' stubborn outlook on looking away from the slaves and onto the picturesque scene of Egypt, including his own statue, which is bigger than his father before, including a statue even bigger than the one his father made of himself before. This could greatly indicate that under the pressure of being the best pharaoh ever, Ramesses has enforced more labor on the slaves to make bigger, grander statues, all in worship of the pharaoh. But such abuse for this false god called the pharaoh would not last. The real God would come to liberate everyone. Ramesses' pressure to be like his father is greatly symbolized with the way he looks out like his father's statue right next to him. Moses tries telling Ramesses that his father bore the blood of innocent children. Ramesses tries to rub it off with the arrogant outlook of seeing the Hebrews as things to be used. Slaves. But Moses counteracts that stubborn outlook by saying, his people. My people. Moses apologizes, giving back the blue ring, officially rejecting any kind of riches that Egypt would have to offer. For he has greater riches in mind in heaven. Not materialistic riches, but spiritual riches of love. The pharaoh looks on in regret, and then hostility. The war between these two brothers had officially began. In this next scene, Moses gets mildly rejected by the Hebrew slaves. And for an understandable reason, Ramesses had doubled the work labor. Yeah, it's like saying to Garfield, you're not gonna get your lasagna on Monday. And here we have a scene of Moses admitting his guilt. In recent years, I could definitely relate to what Moses was going through here. But here, instead of holding on to grudges and bitterness, like Ramesses was, Miriam does what family ought to do. Being the sister of Moses, she forgives Moses and encourages him to keep going. She talks about her own struggles, both daily and spiritually. God had not answered her prayers until now. Sometimes God will deliberately close some doors so that better doors will open up. And another beautiful bit of visual storytelling is the way in which Moses gets up. He leans on his staff, the staff blessed by God. Thus, by leaning on his staff to get up, is as if to say, Moses is leaning on God to keep going. And the moment he gets up, Moses sees Ramesses on his luxurious boat in the Nile. He knows what he has to do. Things get intense when the Pharaoh sends his guards after him. But then, great clouds pass over. The wind blows. You can't see the wind, but much like the wind, you know it's there. And in the same way, God was there. You see Moses looking up, humbled in awe of this mighty, true God, bearing the weight and responsibility of a power which Moses himself can barely grasp at times. Yet Moses is the chosen one to showcase God's wonders. So he applies God's staff to the river Nile. And this is the beginning of the 10 plagues. Now, what's interesting about the 10 plagues is that the plagues were made specifically to mock the Egyptian pagan gods. Because all the Egyptian pagan gods and goddesses represented different aspects of the Egyptian life, like fertility and water and livelihood, livestock, so on and so forth. Not only was God mocking these false gods, but also righteously showcasing the wonder and power of his true nature. Oh yeah, and the guards are now standing on blood. Good luck sleeping tonight. The magicians desperately try to showcase their power. In this version, it's highly implied that they're using practical trickery by means of powder up the sleeve to showcase, haha, we too can turn water into blood. I mean, they could have reserved that water for some nourishment and washing, but no, we're just gonna use it to showcase our pride even more. Again, humans gone wrong tend to be very stubborn. Moses assures his people that if they hold on to the faith, God will see goodness done. For this was just the beginning. Also, something else has just come to mind. I love this visual. As Ramesses is boasting, still, Moses is standing on a patch of fresh water. God is keeping Moses clean. It's like when a person in a patch of clean water is being mocked by other people who are splashing in their own urine.
Something worth noting about the plagues themselves was that it was God's way of showing the fallacies of idolatry and the magnitude of his reality. I've heard some people make moral complaints, like the YouTuber Phantom Strider, who's a nice guy, yet when he said that what God did to the Egyptians then was cruel, he's overlooking some major points about the whole scenario. And even people in his comment section have pointed this out. And I'm going to do the same, because I like clearing things up. Firstly, you ought to know that it was the Egyptians who enslaved and abused the Hebrews first. They had this coming, and so they would pay the consequences for building a kingdom on the backs of abused slaves. I've heard other people make moral complaints that the Bible endorses slavery, but that in itself is another misinterpretation. The Bible endorses humble servanthood, and it clearly condemns abusive slavery and sees everyone as equals. So why would the Egyptians be so cruel? Because they rejected the love of the real God, falling for the temptation that they themselves could be gods. That lie that we mortals can be gods dates all the way back to the incident of the Garden of Eden, when Satan, as a snake, tricked Adam and Eve into saying, "You too shall be as gods, knowing right from wrong." Interesting thing about Satan is that he mixes half-truths with lies. Yes, we would know good and evil, but we ourselves would start committing evil because we're starting to worship our own pride and ego. This is why the Egyptians here worship the pharaoh as well as the other pagan gods. And notice throughout various Egyptian hieroglyphics, and even in some of the pharaoh's attire, notice the serpent-like design. So anyway, why these specific elements for these specific plagues? Well, to start off with the first plague turning the river Nile into blood, this was God's response to the pagan god Hapi, spelled H-A-P-I, the Egyptian god of the river Nile. The river Nile is one of the longest rivers in the world, branching even beyond Egypt itself all the way through Africa. And as we all know, where there's water, there's life. So of course Egypt thrived from being so near the river Nile. But God was symbolically exposing the fact that they achieved their kingdom through spilling blood, through murder. Note that I said through murder, because the Jews of the Old Testament spilled blood through animal sacrifices to atone for their sins. But the Egyptians murdered that they could exalt themselves, not God. Next came the plague of the frogs. In response to the Egyptian goddess of fertility, water, and renewal called Hecate. This attack on Hecate involved Aaron bringing forth the rod of God to summon swarms of frogs from the river Nile after the plague of blood. The magicians were able to bring more frogs, but only Moses was able to make the frogs go away. Again, if the magicians really did have the same powers as God, surely they would have used their powers to put the frogs away like Moses did. But instead, in their pride, they made the situation worse. They tried to show off that they could do the same thing as God instead of fixing the problem right before their eyes. And of course, Pharaoh still refused to let the Hebrew slaves go. Then God attacked the pagan Egyptian god of the earth, Geb. This next plague involved the lice from the dust of the earth. At the command of the Lord to Moses, Aaron was told to stretch forth his rod and smite the dust of the earth, and lice emerged throughout the land, both on people and beast alike. On a theological note, God was the only one who could use the laws of biogenesis to make man from dust. From dust you came, and from dust you shall return. In the context of this plague, it was a reminder of mortality, especially for Pharaoh. Yet still he refused. Fun fact, this was also the last plague that required Aaron's involvement. The next set of 3 plagues are issued by the word of Moses himself. And even still, Pharaoh refused. So next, God attacked, forgive me if I mispronounce this, Khepri, the Egyptian god of creation, movement of the sun, and rebirth. This plague involved swarms of flies. By this point, the Egyptian plagues were becoming more destructive in nature. Yet even still, the pharaoh refused. So then God attacked Hathor, the Egyptian goddess of love and protection. This plague involved the death of cattle and livestock, leading to a great economic disaster. Disease and pestilence spread. Yet Pharaoh still refused, so next God attacked Isis, the Egyptian goddess of medicine and peace. This plague involved ashes turning to boils and sores. This time it was a direct attack on the Egyptian people themselves. Under instruction of God, Moses took ashes from the furnace of affliction and threw them into the air. As the dust of the ashes blew all around Egypt, it settled on man and beast alike in the form of boils and sores. God lends protection to his covenant people. This plague was much more personal, as cleanliness was paramount in the Egyptian society, and the plague pronounces the people unclean, much like their sinful natures, which they would refuse to admit. By this point, the magicians were completely overwhelmed. Ironically enough, the magicians who focused so much on self-righteousness were now in themselves unclean. The magicians had been focusing so much on outwardly ceremonial rituals to these pagan gods and goddesses. But now in their unclean state, they weren't even allowed to stand before the pharaoh himself. And according to biblical scripture, this is the last we hear of these magicians. And appropriately, in the film, this is the last we see of them. So now, the pharaoh has no more backup. whereas Moses and Aaron already had God as their backup the whole time. With God as an unchanging backup and ultimate authority, you'd think the Pharaoh would give up. But nope. The Pharaoh still sees himself as a god and refuses to let the Hebrew slaves go.
So now God had a nutcase to deal with. And not just the Pharaoh, mind you, but also Nut, the Egyptian goddess of the sky.
Do you remember what Farah says in Overwatch?
Justice reigns from above!
In this case, the next plague was hail raining down in the form of fire. Large meteor-like hail rained down from the sky, destroying homes and livestock, and even crops that were used for making clothes. Yet God in his divine mercy still left the wheat, and kept the Egyptians alive. In God's righteous mercy, he gave the Egyptians the chance to repent and come to him. But, yeah, I'll let you fill in the blanks by now. Next, God attacked Seth, the Egyptian god of storms and disorder. This plague involved locusts sent from the sky, and whatever crops they had left were now eaten by these locusts. So God had warned them time and time and time again. In the previous plague, he literally kept the wheat sustaining, giving them the chance to live. But the Pharaoh still refused, so he attacked their crops, and now if they don't change their heart to return to God's love, they will surely die. God provides infinite supplies of bountiful goodness. Pride cannot. Yeah, fill in the blanks here. So then God attacked Ra, the sun god. Let me tell you, don't you dare trust Ra. Because Ra wouldn't believe in the one true God even if the one true God was right in front of his eyes. God is the light, and he is the creator of light. Ra, in comparison, is only an excuse to brag about dominance over the light. And so God sent a plague of darkness upon Egypt. This plague was particularly prominent because the Egyptians worshipped the sun. Just as the scriptures of Romans would later say, they worshipped the creation rather than the creator. Side note, next time someone gives you a gift, don't thank the gift, thank the person who gave you the gift. Gifts don't make themselves. So, by plaguing Egypt with darkness, God was showcasing that he has power over light and darkness. Nothing can stop God, not even death. And so he showcased his dominance over the sun, which the Egyptians worshipped. And this had an immense psychological and religious impact on the Egyptians at the time, since darkness is often associated with death, judgment, hopelessness. And the film brilliantly represents how God protects his people in light. Yet right next door, Egypt was still in darkness, both literally and metaphorically. There was one last false pagan god to confront: the Pharaoh himself. All previous 9 plagues may have affected all of Egypt, even down to the magicians themselves. But Pharaoh himself wouldn't budge, but this last plague would. All previous 9 plagues were to shift Egypt's outlook back to God himself. Now it was the Pharaoh's turn. All the previous 9 plagues I've just mentioned are showcased in an epic song which once again repeats the leitmotif of All I've Ever Wanted, emphasizing from Moses' perspective that this was once his home, now it's being turned upside down as a consequence of the Pharaoh's stubbornness. Fun fact, Ray Fiennes does some singing himself. He's quite good at it. The visual conflict and contrast is clearly seen between these two. Whilst the Hebrews were in the light of God, the Egyptians were still in the darkness. Moses went to the Pharaoh another time more to warn him of something worse that was coming. Funnily enough, this film doesn't just use repetition of music for thematic depth, but it also uses thematic repetition of visuals to drive home the story. In this case, Moses once again ventures through the halls, and he sees the statues of his family, this time torn apart.
much like his relationship with the Pharaoh. The music does play All I've Ever Wanted one last time, as a form of bittersweet nostalgia. Then Moses meets Ramesses at the same place where they used to hang out in their younger days. The scene is slow and hauntingly quiet, with the exception of Moses and Ramesses talking. Moses tries to appeal to Ramesses as a brother, trying to help him remember the good times. Well, however you define good, I mean, there were still Hebrew slaves back in the day, but the better days of their relationship. Moses recalls a funny memory of switching the heads of the gods of Ra. Ramesses recalls them getting into trouble, but then remembers the sweetness of Moses helping him get out of trouble in the end. For you see, in this creative adaptation, it's made abundant that these two genuinely still love each other. Ramesses softly says, "Why can't things be like the way they were before?" And maybe, just maybe in that moment, if the Pharaoh had humbled himself more to see the bigger picture of things, maybe he would have changed his mind to let the Hebrew slaves go just then. But the harshness of pride and sin against God had other plans. Moses and Ramesses could have been a family once again, but destiny would pit them against each other so that the Hebrew slaves would be free. Ramesses could still step away from his bride, and this reality steps back in when Ramesses hears the call of his son, his firstborn son. And there's visually symbolic significance with the fact that they are now talking in the exact same room with the hieroglyphs of the Pharaoh ordering the death of the babies being thrown to the crocodiles in the River Nile. That was seen in an earlier scene. It plays a big part here. The boy says, "Isn't that the man who did all this?" Ramesses says, "Yes." But why? Moses reminds him, because no kingdom should be made on the backs of slaves, and informs him that his arrogance is causing the destruction of Egypt, and it would cease if he just let them go. The Pharaoh once again holds on to his stubborn position that he is the god of Egypt. He is the morning and evening star. And yet, Pharaoh holds no power to stop the unstoppable God. And Moses is warning him to think of his son. His son! But Ramesses arrogantly says, "My father had the right idea on how to deal with your people, and now it's time for me to finish the job." And at this point, Ramesses is going to be practically eating his words for breakfast. "And there shall be a great cry in all of Egypt, such as never has been or ever will be again." I'm just generalizing here. Ray Fiennes would have said it better than me. And then we see the same visuals of Moses seeing the image cutting from the Pharaoh's face to his hand pointing towards, cut to the guards throwing the babies into, zoom towards the crocodiles. This time, the firstborn son is positioned where the babies are being fed. Then we see a visual of the boy caught right in the middle of the conflict. Poor boy. The image is specifically composed so that we can see the contrasting sides and we see exactly what's going to happen. We see the Pharaoh stretch out his arm in contrast. We see Ramesses point out his hand, just like his father engraved in the image above him. We see Moses on the side of the Hebrews now, seeing them as people, to the right, looking on in shock and horror, much like he did when he first came across that carven image. And then, smack dab in the middle, is Ramesses' firstborn son, positioned precisely where the babies are being fed to die. Moses leaves this scene saying, "Ramesses, you bring this upon yourself. This bears even greater weight and significance, especially when you know what's coming next." Now, something I haven't mentioned was that
this film uses its visuals to its highest advantage to such a degree that the filmmakers even made this emotional beat board. The way it works is that they structured all the scenes, acts 1, 2, 3, and 4. Yes, some movies have 4 acts. It could be argued that a lot of movies have 4 acts. And they are meant to be structured in such a way to appropriately highlight the emotional highs and lows. And alongside Moses' emotional highs and lows, there's also the intended audience emotional response. And to complement this, not only do they tell you this, they show you it visually through specific color tones. What's great about these color tones is that usually there's this rule in filmmaking where if you want to get in the mood for a particular scene, you've got to have a limited color tone. For scenes, you can still have a wider range of color tones throughout the movie, but individual scenes need to establish a mood with specific color tones. So, we start off getting to know the land of Egypt, ranging from these warm colors to soothing blues. Then we get bright colors in the chariot race. Then it sort of goes mysterious during the night sequence. And it goes truly dark for the revelation. Then soothing blue when the queen reprises, and then sort of a ominous sort of beige during Moses' interference with the slave driver and his running away. Then it's very colorful during Look to Heaven's Eyes. Then we get amazing soothing colors with the burning bush scene. And then we get colors to get us in the mood, and then colors are a bit more exaggerated. And then comes this scene, as well as the death of the firstborn. Then comes this scene, death of the firstborn. The angel of death scene is depicted only in black, white, and red. This is particularly important, especially when you understand the context of the scene. Firstly, the scene starts out with the reason that people celebrate Passover in the first place. The context of the Passover was that Moses was told by God that the Hebrew people had to take lamb and sacrifice it, and then use the lamb's blood to paint their doorposts. And then stay inside, keep warm, keep safe, have a nice meal, rest easy. God would send the angel of death to kill all the firstborn in Egypt. This in turn was to signify how the Pharaoh had previously slaughtered the firstborn of all the Hebrew families. The angel of death would pass over all Egypt, would kill all the firstborn of the Egyptian families. Yet when the angel of death would pass by the doors with the lamb's blood on it, he would acknowledge and pass by them. And whoever had the lamb's blood on their doors would be safe. Now, sacrifice and atonement for sin was a very common practice for the Jews of the Old Testament. Whenever sin occurred, sacrifices had to be made in order to atone for them. And the Jews celebrate the Passover as a celebration from being liberated from slavery in Egypt. Yet it wasn't until many years later that someone very much like Moses, but even greater, would come along to complete the picture of atonement and sacrifice. Jesus Christ himself. Now, Christians believe that Jesus Christ completed the picture of atonement and sacrifice because Jesus himself lived a life without any sin whatsoever. Historians like Tacitus and Josephus admitted that Jesus did many wondrous works. And to add to that, Jesus purposefully went to be crucified to suffer the death penalty that all of us deserved. Old Testament prophecies called Jesus the Lamb of God. So much like the lambs that were sacrificed to save Moses and his people, so too was the Lamb of God sacrificed to save all people. Now, the condition to be saved is to accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior and to repent.
Why would Jesus do this? Because even if we tried, none of us could live the perfect life. We have all sinned at some point. And even the Pharisees back in Jesus' day were getting so caught up in self-righteousness. Yet Jesus came to live the life that we couldn't, to showcase how a good life can be lived, to stay humble, to love others, and to free people from pride. And this message isn't just for the Jews anymore. It's for everyone, Romans, Gentiles, and even the Egyptians. All you gotta do is follow him. Happy Easter, everybody! Pardon me, I just had to clarify that up for theological purposes. Going back to the story of Moses now, and now that you understand the context, you realize the significance of the red of the blood. Funnily enough, ounces of color in this very bleak black and white scenario. It's made black and white in a bleak setting to purposefully complement the sorrowful atmosphere that this is creating. And there's no music during this sequence. The angel of death is a beautiful white light whizzing through this darkened, sinful city, sparing the Hebrews who put lamb's blood on their door. Only the blood of the lamb will save you. Only the blood of the lamb will save you. And what's particularly striking about the scene is the sound effects. Precisely whenever the angel of death would bring death upon the firstborn, the sound effect used for separating the spirits of the firstborn from their biological bodies, we hear a sound akin to breathing out, like that's not just a metaphor for last breath. On a theological standpoint, this is God taking back the breath of God. What do we mean by the breath of God? When God formed Adam, he poured in the breath of God into Adam. What does it mean to have the breath of God? To have the breath of God is to be a conscious moral agent of free will and experience. After all, we are made in God's image, and God has known us before we were born. We are biologically hardwired to worship God. And God loves us so much, he gave us the free will to choose whether or not we want to worship God. If we didn't have free will, then we'd be forced to worship God, and that wouldn't be real love. Real love involves giving people the choice. It was a risky move, but God did it anyway. To have the breath of God in us is not to indicate that we ourselves are gods per se, but it's to indicate that we have the essence of God in us. We have our moral compass. We have consciousness, experience, and all sorts of metaphysical qualities that cannot be physically measured. This part of us is our soul looking out on this material realm. So what it means to have the breath of God taken away from the body is simply a soul departing from the body. So when God is taking back the breath of God, he's bringing souls back to the spiritual realm. And in this film, it's not brutal. It's rather peaceful. God brings back the souls of all the firstborn of Egypt. And after that is done, God returns to the heavens. We see a starry sky, and then we hear a great cry in all of Egypt, such as never been seen or ever will be again. I told you Ramesses would be eating his words for breakfast. I think that amazing scene of God's light passing over the Pharaoh statue is indicating God's dominance over the Pharaoh. Then we come to a scene that many of the filmmakers who made this movie will admit are their personal favorites. Then we come to the permission to leave scene, a scene which even other filmmakers say is one of their favorite scenes in the production. A scene
which several of the filmmakers who made The Prince of Egypt will say they have yet to see scenes just like that in any other animated media. See, this is what animation is capable of. Not just fodder for Hollywood fun. Not just sugar-coated sugar rushes for children, but an art form as well that can bring many a vision to life. Animation can depict anything. Anything. We could have some award-winning movies akin to live-action dramas in which the storytelling is enhanced through the visuals. But anyway, onto the scene itself. This is also Moses' last emotional low point in this movie. We hear faintly the loud cries of all Egypt mourning their firstborn. Then we see an image of Ramesses taking his son on a pedestal and putting a blanket on him. Moses enters in. There's not a lot of talking, nor is there that much music. Just the sheer weight of the emotions and the scenario and the colors of the visuals. It speaks for itself. Ramesses tells Moses, "At last, you and your people have my permission to go." God and Moses, they tried to warn him. They tried to warn Pharaoh. But his stubbornness brought more destruction. But unfortunately, as we all know, Ramesses would change his mind and try to kill all the slaves later on. What's amazing, again, from a visual storytelling perspective, we don't get a scene of internal monologue or anything like that. No, we just get a look. Moses leaves the scene. Ramesses is looking mournfully at his son. Then he looks back. The bitter rage. Nothing is said, apart from the permission to leave and to leave him alone. But that look, as the music begins to play, seals the deal with foreshadowing that Ramesses is going to change his mind. Moses steps away from the scene, crying his heart out. Yeah, Val Kilmer poured his heart and soul into this role. And then Moses and his people finally leave Egypt. Which then, of course, leads to the film's award-winning song, When You Believe. That's one thing that surprises me. I'm surprised this film didn't win awards for every category. Yet it won the award for this particular song. And chances are, if for some reason you haven't seen or heard of this movie, you might very well have heard this song somewhere. Because in the end credits, there's another version of the song sung by the late Whitney Houston and Mariah Carey, both divas of singing. It's a song about internal struggle, and a song about believing in the light of hope, in spite of all the struggles. Many people online and in the music industry have covered this song. It's essentially a big ballad. We all gotta love those power ballads. It's a song in which the singers admittedly question their own faith. Yet through these struggles, their faith only grows stronger. That's something I've noticed about the most dedicated people of God. That no matter what challenges come their way, answers and solutions will come. All you gotta do is just hold on. According to this Wikipedia article, it says in the lyrical context section, as a bridge, a chorus of children sings excerpts. According to this Wikipedia article, it says, as a bridge, a chorus of children sings excerpts of the Song of the Sea in Hebrew. During the middle part of the song, the children sing Ashira, Adonai, Ki Gaorga, meaning, I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Mi hamocha be'elem Adonai. Who is like you, O Lord, among the celestials? Mi Hamocham Nedar Bachodesh, who is like you, majestic in holiness. Nahi Tavehastaha Amzul Gahalta. In your love, you lead the people you redeemed. Ashira, Ashira, Ashira. Bam! There can be miracles. Everybody! When you believe, when you believe. Then comes one of the greatest miracles ever recorded in biblical history. The parting of the Red Sea. This scene is big. This scene is epic. This scene, if I get this correctly, took about 2 or so years to animate right. Yeah, all that effort on the traditional animation and CGI animation focusing on water, one of the hardest elements to get right through animation, in an effort akin to the Stampede sequence from The Lion King in terms of production efforts. And they did this back in the 90s, where the technology is somewhat primitive compared to today's standards. I think the amazing, awesome imagery of this entire scene pretty much speaks for itself. The fish in the water, the elements, the characters' looks. I don't think there's much to comment on here. Although I will say this, Ramesses did change his mind and charge after the Hebrews, but God summoned a pillar of fire to stop the Egyptians. Now, it's worth noting that before coming to the Red Sea, Moses and his people were following God in the form of a pillar of cloud in the day and in the form of a pillar of fire in the night. So, in a way, the Hebrews were already familiar with this pillar of fire by the time it struck down on the ground to stop the Egyptians, giving Moses and the Hebrews the chance that they needed to provide another way to the promised land. Now, they could have taken some specific routes, but God wanted them to take a special shortcut, as well as to showcase his grand authority. Moses, with the power of God, parts the Red Sea with his rod, bringing a wind so strong it parts the waves in two, forming a pathway for the people to walk through. Then once the Hebrews are almost at the other side, God stops the pillar of fire. And here, many people would probably make the moral complaint, oh, why didn't God keep the pillar of fire there longer? Well, actually, this was God giving the Pharaoh one last warning. By divine mercy, God is now giving the Pharaoh the choice. In Samurai Jack's words, leave here now and live, or stay and face your destiny. Or in the proper context of this scene, go back and live, or attempt to go after the Hebrew people and face the consequences. Pharaoh led the charge of his many chariots and went on ahead to slaughter the Hebrews. Unfortunately, their chariots didn't really stand a chance against the unsturdy ground of the seafloor. But fortunately, God allowed all of his Hebrew people to make it to the other side just in time for God to stop parting the Red Sea and let the oceans collapse in on themselves, absolutely demolishing and wiping out every trace of the Egyptian army. Now, according to this website I've just looked up, it says that the pharaoh at the time, according to some scholars, was likely Amenhotep II. So whether it was Ramesses II or Amenhotep II is up for academic debate, but it details in Psalm 136, verse 15, we find that God overthrew Pharaoh and his army in the Red Sea. The Hebrew word translated there as overthrew is nar, also found in Exodus 14:27. It does not mean to drown or to toss or tumble about as in the water, or some have attempted to assert. It simply means shook off. And it seems once again the filmmakers did their homework, thanks to the advice of the theologians, as Ramesses here is tossed back onto the shore, alone, isolated, and in ruin and misery. In this creative adaptation, Ramesses cries out to Moses one last time. It would seem that God has left him alive to get him to think about the consequences of his actions, and maybe, just maybe, turn from his evil ways before it's too late. Moses looks back over the sea, acknowledges the condition of his brother. Something that's quite profound in this movie is that Moses' last line in this movie is, "Goodbye, brother. Their relationship is over." But then the film ends off on an understandably more uplifting note, with the Hebrew people finally being free from Egypt. And the last line spoken in this movie is from Zipporah. "Look at your people. They're free. They are free indeed." And then the film ends off with something just as epic as that. Moses walking down from Mount Sinai, carrying the stones inscribing the 10 Commandments, written with thunder and lightning by God himself. Now, I would assume that we are witnessing Moses' second descent from Mount Sinai, because the first time he went down the mountain with the 10 Commandments, all of his people were going crazy, worshipping idols in impatience. And then Moses smashed the 10 Commandments to pieces. And long story short, Moses had to do it again. Yeah, I think I'm assuming this is the second time Moses is doing it. Either way, Moses looks upon his people. The last shot of the film, Moses looking over his people. He's got a flock to take care of now. And God is going to witness the whole thing through until they all reach the promised land. Now, tragically enough, Moses and his people would go through many trials and tribulations in the desert, and Moses would lose his patience from time to time, striking rocks to bring forth spring water. And because of Moses' impatience, God didn't allow Moses to enter into the promised land. However, when Moses died, at the age of 120, God did allow Moses to at least see the promised land. Whew! There. Done. That, my friends, is a full analysis of the Prince of Egypt. I guess it was more of a theological lecture on Exodus in general, really. But that just goes to show how awesome this animated movie is. This film is a masterpiece. And it only gets better the more I see it, despite its mild flaws and inaccuracies. You have just watched one of the most in-depth analyses of this movie you'll find on YouTube, which goes to show how much I love this movie. And I won't bore you with any sort of conclusion, so I'm just gonna abruptly end the video here. Oh, actually, I do like the song I Will Get There by Boys to Men. I will get through the night and make it through to the other side. Get there, get there, get there. I'm not the best singer. Thank you so much for watching. God bless you all. Feel free to share this with friends. Spread the love. Happy Passover. Happy Easter. Dzień dobry.
And it's a pretty brutal sight to see.